After my wife passed away, I used to think my son came to visit out of love. But then when he found out I was still receiving my pension, he and his wife began showing up more often with smiles on their faces and a plan in mind. My name is Arthur Langdon. I'm 68 years old. A retired electrical engineer, lives alone in a wooden house by the river in Wilmington, North Carolina. This is my true story. Before I tell you what I did, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe so more people can hear this story. After Marjorie passed, the house by the Wilmington River grew so quiet I could hear the drip of water in the pipes. I used to think when my son came back it was out of love, but when he found out I was still getting my pension, the calls began steady, precise, like someone had drawn them into a schedule. The evening messages, the careful questions, the sudden visits, they came all at once, as if someone had found a key to a memory I no longer wanted to open. That morning fog hung over the river, soft and thick, blurring the far bank. The first light of day slid across the water, scattering against the porch ceiling like fragments of glass. I brewed a cup of black coffee and sat where Marjorie used to sit, beside the half-dried lavender bed. She used to say lavender helped people remember the good things, even when life had already turned elsewhere. On the table lay the envelope from the Federal Pension Fund, the monthly check $3,200. 40 years at Brunswick Utilities. I gave it everything, my back, my bones, the better part of my life. The phone rang, cutting through the morning stillness. I glanced at the number. Unfamiliar. I almost didn't pick up, then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in months. Smooth, polite, but distant. Dad, Vanessa and I will come by this weekend. Just want to make sure you're doing okay. Travis. For a second I couldn't speak. In this house since Marjorie died, no one had called me Dad, except in memory. The word fell like a stone into a deep well. I felt something stir, not quite joy, not quite fear. I said softly, "Sure, I'll be here," then hung up. My hand trembled a little. That afternoon I dusted the living room, wiped the thin film off the oak table, straightened the wedding photo that had leaned for years. In it, Marjorie's smile was all light and trust. I didn't know what to say to Travis when he came. We used to be close once, back when the world was simpler, before ambition became a wall between us. When he left home, he said he wanted to build his own life. Since then, all that's remained between us were short calls and shorter words. Saturday came clear and golden. The river shimmered like polished glass. A silver SUV rolled up the gravel drive, the sound of its tires sharp against the quiet. Travis stepped out first, pressed shirt, confident stride, the faint scent of cologne. Vanessa followed, heels clicking against the stone path, a bouquet of red tulips in her hand. She smiled, soft, beautiful, but practiced. "You look better than I expected, Dad," she said, her voice honeyed but hollow. I smiled, invited them in. Travis laid his coat over the chair. Vanessa wandered the room, eyes scanning every corner, the old clock, the framed photographs, the desk. Then her gaze paused on the small table where the pension envelope still sat open. The air shifted. The faint lavender scent from the window was drowned by the heavy perfume she wore. I went to the kitchen to pour coffee, and in that brief silence, something inside me twisted a small, wordless suspicion. They praised the house, the view, the light. Then came the talk about the market, about rising property values. Travis laughed lightly. Said I should consider selling, move into a senior community in Charlotte somewhere with people my age. Vanessa added that those places had medical support, comfort, no need to live alone like this. I said quietly, "I'm not alone. I'm exactly where I belong." The silence that followed was thicker than fog. Travis changed the subject to work, talked about clients falling through, about interest rates and bad quarters. He spoke fast, avoiding my eyes. I could hear what he wasn't saying, the debts, the cracks behind the smile. When I went to the kitchen for more cookies, I heard a faint scrape, a chair shifting paper, rustling. When I came back, Vanessa was smiling at nothing in particular, her phone turned face down on the table. The pension envelope was slightly out of place, just enough to tell me what I needed to know. We talked a little longer, small things, polite things. Vanessa described a new listing. Travis asked about the neighbors, but the distance between us was a wall. I watched their mouths move and realized I didn't recognize their voices anymore. When they stood to leave, Vanessa leaned in for a hug. Her hand brushed my shoulder, cold, perfunctory. "If you ever need anything, just call," she said. It sounded rehearsed. They left as the sun dipped below the trees. I stood on the porch watching the SUV glide down the road, its taillights fading to a pair of red dots. In the quiet that followed, I heard what sounded like a lock turning somewhere deep inside my chest. Back inside, the air still held the ghost of her perfume. I sat down, staring at the check still lying on the table. The lamp cast a warm light on the numbers $200, bright and unfeeling. I picked it up. The paper was thin, but it carried the weight of 40 years of work of promises made and kept. Outside, the river kept moving slow and steady, same as ever. I listened to the sound of its steady, patient, unjudging. The scent of lavender drifted in through the open window, sharp and sweet, catching in my throat. I thought of Marjorie, her last morning, her hand on mine. She told me not to let the house go. I thought she meant the walls, the roof, the land, but now I knew she meant something else, something harder to hold. I looked toward the porch. The moonlight spilled through the window, cutting across the table, falling right over the check. Half in light, half in shadow. And I knew then, from that very moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, fog lay thick over the river, soft as smoke. Sunlight broke through the oak branches above the porch, scattering dappled gold across the wooden steps. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the kettle hiss, the smell of coffee rising like memory. It was the same routine every morning since Marjorie passed the quiet ritual that made the silence less sharp. But that morning, something inside me felt unsettled. I thought of their visit the day before, Vanessa's careful smile, Travis's darting eyes, and felt a chill in the way they had looked around this house like appraisers, not family. By late Saturday, they came again. No call, no warning. The silver SUV pulled up the drive, the door slamming shut with a dull thud that carried through the still air. Travis stepped out, holding a basket of pastries. Vanessa followed, clutching a bouquet of red roses, her perfume reaching the porch before her. Both of them smiling, too bright, too even. "Dad, we brought these from a new bakery in Raleigh," Vanessa said, her tone smooth, sugared like frosting. I smiled, thanked her, took the basket. She moved inside her heels, clicking against the wood floor, Travis behind her eyes, scanning the living room. He stopped in front of the wedding photo, stared longer than he meant to, then looked away. Something in his mother's gaze must have burned too close. We sat. I asked about work, about the drive. The words hung light as dust. Travis started talking about the housing market again, interest rates, clients, backing out, projects frozen. I nodded, not adding a word. Vanessa crossed one leg over the other, gaze sliding across the room like a camera lens. I saw her take in every corner, every detail. The way she looked at my house, Reminded me of the young agents I'd met during my working years, the ones who valued nothing they couldn't price. She complimented the foundation, said the floors looked sturdy, the roof well kept. Then sighed, soft and deliberate, noting that homes like this were being bought up for luxury riverfront retreats. I gave a faint smile. I went to the kitchen for tea. Their voices murmured through the hall, low but clear enough for stray words to reach me. When I returned, Vanessa was smiling again, her phone face down on the table, though I'd seen the screen lit a second before. I poured the tea. Steam clouded the space between us. Travis took a sip, then looked at me, voice tentative. "Dad, don't you get lonely out here? Wilmington's peaceful. Sure, but it's quiet. Maybe too quiet." I said, calm and steady. "I've lived here my whole life. I'll stay here for the rest of it." The air thickened. Vanessa pressed her lips together, set her cup down, eyes drifting toward the window. Outside, the lavender moved gently in the wind, a soft ripple of color. Travis forced a smile. "I just worry, that's all. The house is big. Maintenance repairs, it's a lot. If you'd like, I could help you list it. You could move closer to us in Raleigh." I met his eyes. The boy who once begged to ride in my truck, who used to hand me tools and laugh at the smell of motor oil, now spoke about selling this house like it was inventory. I shook my head. Not out of anger, but something heavier disappointment. "Your mother planted those flowers out there herself," I said quietly. "Every spring I fix the porch steps. This house isn't a burden, Travis. It's what's left of our life together." He said nothing. Vanessa glanced at him, then smiled, tilting her head just so her voice gentle, almost kind. "That's beautiful, Dad," she said, but the light in her eyes had turned calculating. I stood, said I'd check something in the yard. As I passed the hallway, I looked through the glass door. Vanessa was holding her phone up, camera angled toward the table, toward the stack of mail and the bank envelopes. A glint from the lens caught my eye. Then she lowered it quickly, smiled again when she saw me returning. I walked into the kitchen and stopped. My body knew before my mind did. A kind of charge, like standing near a live wire. In 40 years as an engineer, I'd learned to sense when a system was about to fail. And right then I felt that same hum, only this time it was inside my own home. When I came back, Travis was talking louder, describing a new project, Vanessa nodding like it mattered. I listened, but didn't really hear. Their words floated above something darker, something both of them were too careful to name. The visit ended as the light faded. I walked them to the door. Vanessa took my hand in hers, warm on the surface, cold underneath. "We'll stop by again soon," she said, eyes holding mine a second too long. They stepped off the porch. Travis opened the car door for her, and before she got in, she leaned close, whispered something to him. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way his head dipped, the small, guilty nod. The SUV rolled down the driveway, taillights flickering red between the trees. I stood there long after it vanished. The air was damp, smelling of river and earth. Inside, everything looked the same, but felt different. I noticed the pension envelope slightly off-center from where I'd left it that morning. Nothing missing, but something gone. Night came quickly. I turned off the lights, sat in the darkened room, letting the porch lamp cast a faint glow across the floor. Crickets hummed outside. The breeze carried the scent of lavender, faint, almost fragile. I thought about Vanessa's eyes, about the last thing she said. I wasn't sure if I'd heard it right, or if it was just my mind playing tricks. But the words replayed anyway, low and clear, like an echo carried by the wind. "You were right. He still gets it. $3,000 a month. Guaranteed." I sat still, staring into the dark. Outside, the river moved slow and silver under the moonlight, calm as ever. But I knew that calm wouldn't last. The wind that was coming wasn't from the river. It was coming from my own blood. In the days that followed, the house grew busy in a way I hadn't asked for. The phone rang more often. Each time it was Vanessa's voice, sweet as honey, smooth as glass, but carrying something sharp beneath it. She asked if I was eating enough, if I wanted her to pay my utility bills online, if I'd taken care of the property tax yet. At first I thought it was concern, the kind that comes too late after a family has already fallen apart. But her concern arrived with the precision of an appointment. Every morning, every evening. Always polite. Always timed. One morning, I was mowing the lawn when the phone buzzed again. Vanessa said she'd set up an online payment account for me, so I wouldn't have to worry about bills. I asked why she'd do that. She laughed lightly, said all I needed to do was send the verification code when it arrived. I cut her off. I told her I still knew how to write a check. Her voice faltered, then softened again, syrupy as ever. I just want to help Dad. I hung up, wiped the sweat from my neck. The oak trees rustled in the wind, and for the first time in months, the sound of leaves felt like a warning. A week later, Travis showed up. No call ahead, a new habit. He carried a folder wrapped in plastic and set it on the oak table where I read the paper every morning. The title at the top caught the light, emergency power of attorney. I looked up. He smiled carefully, the kind of smile that wants to look harmless. It's just precaution, Dad. In case you ever get sick or something happens, someone needs to keep the property in order. I sat still. Sunlight slanted through the window, lighting the pages like they were glowing from within. Who told you to draw this up? I asked. He hesitated, then said, Vanessa's lawyer thought it'd be smart. I pushed the folder back toward him. I still mow my own lawn, fix my own fences, and I'm clear enough to know when to sign something. His jaw tightened, but he only nodded. His hands were clenched beneath the table. That evening I sat on the porch. The streetlight cast a pale glow over the river, still and glittering. It looked peaceful enough to fool a man. I remembered the years climbing power poles in storms, my hands frozen, my grip steady because it had to be. Back then, I thought no storm could break me. But this was a different kind of storm. It didn't come from the sky. It came from within the walls of home. After that, I started paying attention. Vanessa kept calling. Her tone never changed, light, cheerful, careful. She asked what I'd eaten, if I'd taken my medicine, if I'd ever thought about refinancing the house since property values had gone up. She said it casually, like talking about the weather. But the way she said our house, not your house, stayed in my ears long after the call ended. Another afternoon, Travis brought over a large envelope. Just a medical update form, he said, sliding it across the table. I read it line by line. At the bottom, in fine print, was a section for joint authorization. I looked up. What's this part? He waved a hand. Just standard procedure. Nothing serious. I folded the paper neatly, put it back in the envelope. If it's nothing serious, you won't mind if my attorney looks it over. He smiled, small and crooked. Of course not. Then he changed the subject, money car repairs. A job delayed the usual storm of excuses. When he left, I opened my drawer and pulled out every document I owned, bills, insurance forms, old mortgage statements. Everything looked right, but the order of things felt wrong. Someone somewhere had begun touching the edges of my life. The next Wednesday morning, I was sweeping the porch when I saw Earl Patterson crossing the street. 70, maybe 71. My old co-worker. We used to drink beer on Fridays back when life had rhythm. He was holding a newspaper, his face lined with something between worry and disbelief. "Arthur," he called out. "Did you transfer your property?" I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He handed me the paper. His finger stopped at a small column halfway down the page. Local notices printed in fine type. "Temporary deed transfer. New Hanover County. Owner: Arthur Langdon, co-beneficiary, Travis Langdon." My stomach dropped. I read it again. And again. The names didn't change. Mine, his, the address of my home, this home. Earl shifted his weight, lowered his voice. "Could be a filing error, but you might want to check." He looked at me with the kind of pity a man gives another when he doesn't know what else to offer. I nodded, thanked him, and watched him walk back across the road. Inside, I laid the newspaper flat on the table. The sunlight hit the page, and the black ink seemed to throb. My chest tightened. The phone calls, the papers, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes. It all began to fall into place, a pattern I hadn't wanted to see. I opened the drawer, pulled out every envelope again, checking signatures, seals, every page, all intact, all untouched. Yet I knew deep down that if something had been forged, it wouldn't surprise me. Greed rarely comes dressed in cruelty. It comes dressed as care. That evening I called the county records office. A woman's voice answered polite routine. I asked about the filing. She said yes, an electronic transfer submitted by a notary office in Raleigh. I asked who filed it. She paused, then said, "Representative name Vanessa Langdon." I held the phone fingers stiff around the receiver. Outside, the sun was bleeding out over the river, staining the water red. The wind pushed against the porch door, rattling the glass. Everything looked calm. But I knew something had already broken. I read the notice again, the same line, the same names, until the words blurred. My pulse hammered in my ears. There was only one thought left in my head. Something was wrong. And this time it wasn't just a feeling. The next morning, I drove to the new Hanover County Clerk's office. The road along the river was quiet, thin mist still clinging to the windshield as the wipers brushed it away in long, tired arcs. I parked behind the building where the old oak trees leaned over the lot, their branches heavy and still. The courthouse rose ahead of me. Red brick, worn stone steps, like an old sentry who'd seen too many stories end in paperwork. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and printer ink, that sterile chill of government air conditioning. Footsteps and the rhythmic hum of a scanner filled the space, a heartbeat inside a beast made of bureaucracy. At the counter sat a middle-aged woman with a name badge pinned neatly to her blouse. I gave her my name. My address told her I wanted to check on a property transfer I'd seen listed in the paper. She nodded politely, fingers poised above the keyboard. The glow of the monitor flickered across her glasses. She asked for my date of birth and the last 4 digits of my Social Security, then began scrolling. When she stopped, I saw her brow lift just slightly. "There's a deed transfer on file," she said, carefully choosing her words. "Pending confirmation. It includes a notarized statement saying you appeared in person and signed before a notary public." My throat went dry. I told her that was impossible. I hadn't signed anything, hadn't met any notary, hadn't even driven to Raleigh as the form apparently stated. She studied me for a moment, then offered to print the record for review. The page slid from the printer, warm and crisp, the letters black and official, cold as river ice. Applicant Vanessa Langdon, listed as representative. Notary, Harold Ness Raleigh office. Verification. Arthur Langdon appeared before me, presented identification, and acknowledged this signature as his own. Below it, the notary's embossed seal date, electronic file number. I read each line like swallowing stones. It felt like the day I lost my footing on a pole line back in '93, thunder cracking in my ears, while the whole world tilted, and the only thing keeping me alive was the wire I refused to let go of. I told her this had to be an error, or worse, a forgery. She didn't argue. Her voice softened. You can request a temporary hold on the confirmation and submit for a verification review. I'll print the forms for you. I thanked her, though my hand trembled when I reached for the papers. As I walked out of the office, my steps slowed, careful, like I was walking across glass that might break under my weight. Outside beneath the oak canopy, the air was warmer, but the cold inside me didn't lift. I called Earl. He picked up on the first ring, voice tight with worry. "Where are you?" "At the county office," I said. "You need to see something." "Stay there," he said. 5 minutes. Earl arrived carrying the faint smell of motor oil and the weight of a man who'd spent his life fixing what other people broke. He took the papers, read them slowly, jaw tightening as he went. "This isn't a mix-up," he muttered. "I'm calling Grace. She's in law school. She'll know where to start." We waited inside the lobby. A few minutes later, a young woman hurried in, brown hair, tied back canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Grace Patterson. Her handshake was firm, her tone clear and businesslike. She asked for the papers and a few details, then led us to one of the public terminals. Her fingers flew across the keyboard faster than I could follow. She opened the electronic deed record, scanned the log, then pointed to a timestamp. "Filed at 10:18 a.m., she said from a notary office in Raleigh. She clicked further, pulling up the attached verification file. There it was in bold type, appeared before me. Harold Ness, on December 12th. She looked at me. "Where were you that day I didn't have to think?" "Home," I said. "I was trimming the back fence, replaced 3 boards, had a beer with Earl in his garage that night." Earl nodded immediately. "We were there till 9. I'll write it down if needed." His voice was tight, angry now. Grace scrolled lower. The submitting agent was listed as Vanessa Langdon, using a small commercial law firm's address in downtown Raleigh. Her tone dropped, measured. "That could just be a drop address," she said, "or it could mean they're working together. Either way, we flag this." She printed out a dispute and hold request form and guided me through each section, explaining line by line, her pen tapping where I needed to sign. "This statement," she said, "swears you never appeared before the notary. If this notarization is false, that's a serious offense." When the forms were filed, she didn't stop. Grace opened the metadata of the scanned document, zoomed in on the corner of the digital record. "See this?" she said. The scan came from an older model device from the notary's office, but the last login came from a mobile device not registered to that system. She frowned. "That's not hard evidence, but it's a trail. It suggests someone accessed it remotely." I asked quietly, "And what does that mean, deeper investigation?" She met my eyes, steady and unflinching. "It means someone might have built a document to steal your home. And if that's true, it's not just family business anymore." The words hit harder than thunder. I thought of Travis, the way he'd looked at the wedding photo, the way he'd talked about selling the house like it was already gone. I thought of Vanessa, her perfect smile, that calculating gleam when she tilted her head, the camera flash on my table. It all snapped into place, one wire after another, humming in the dark. Grace printed a checklist of next steps. The hold was filed. Next was a formal fraud notice to the notary office. She told me not to contact Vanessa directly and to keep any new mail sealed postmarks intact. Even the smallest detail, she said, can anchor an entire case. Earl offered to drive me home. I said no. I needed a moment alone. He didn't push, just told me to call if I needed anything. Grace said she'd stay near the courthouse another hour to file supplemental forms. She was young, but her confidence steadied me. Outside, I walked down the courthouse steps and paused on the last one. The wind off the river carried a faint trace of salt, and something else, iron, maybe, or memory. The oak leaves rustled overhead. I looked up at the courthouse facade, the red bricks weathered by time, and thought about my name printed inside that file. My life flattened into a forged signature. For the first time in my life, I saw the Langdon name not as family, but as a legal transaction gone wrong. I drove home in silence, my hands still tingling from the courthouse. The road along the river was empty, the wind carrying salt, and the first cold breath of winter. When I reached the porch, I stood there for a long time, staring at the wooden door where the afternoon light had faded into the old paint. That house had once been pride. Now it felt like a front line. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. That night I called Travis. I told him we needed to talk in the morning. He said one word, "Yeah," and hung up. By dawn, Wilmington was wrapped in a slow, steady rain. Not a storm, just that kind of patient drizzle that feels like the sky already knows what's coming. I set the table, made coffee, left the door open. When the silver SUV pulled into the drive, the sound of its tires on wet gravel cut through the quiet. Travis stepped inside, coat, damp hair, dripping into his eyes. He didn't look at me. I pointed to the chair. "Sit down, Travis. We need to talk." He dropped his keys on the table, his gaze wandering. I slid a photocopy across the wood toward him. "You know anything about this property transfer?" He glanced at the paper, said nothing. His eyes didn't flinch, just waited. I asked again, slower this time. "Do you know about this?" The air thickened between us. Finally, he looked up. His voice cracked. "You've spent your whole life working, Dad. You were never around. You cared more about this house than your own son. So tell me, what are you really holding on to?" The words hit harder than I expected. I'd been ready for guilt, not accusation. I answered quietly, the edge of anger in my throat. "I'm holding on to a promise one I made to your mother. She wanted this house to stay in the family, to be proof that not everything has to disappear." Travis gave a sharp, broken laugh. "Family. That's rich. The only thing I remember is you out there with power lines and night shifts and her alone inside this house. That's the promise you made to vanish." I stood, stepping closer, my voice lowered. "You don't understand. When your mother died, this house was all that was left of her. It's not property, Travis. It's witness." He stared back, his anger trembling into something else, something wounded. "Maybe you're not keeping it for her," he said, his voice flat. "Maybe you're keeping it to pay for your own guilt. You think I don't know. You've been hiding things. The pension, the money. You think we didn't find out?" The air in my chest turned hot. So they knew. Vanessa's visits, the soft voice, the smiles, all of it had been prelude. I said, steady but shaking, I never hid anything. "That pension is what I earned every year I froze on a pole to keep this town lit. If you think that's something to be ashamed of, I have nothing left to say." He rose abruptly, moved to the window. The rain had thinned to a mist, drops clinging to the glass like tiny lights. His reflection looked smaller than I remembered. He spoke without turning. "You don't get it. Vanessa's trying to help. She said if you keep resisting, the court can declare you legally incompetent. You won't be able to sign for anything." Then his phone rang. He hesitated, then put it on speaker. Vanessa's voice filled the room, cool, clear, practiced. "If he doesn't cooperate, the court can appoint a guardian. Once that happens, Arthur won't have legal control over the property. He should think carefully before letting it come to that. I looked at my son, really looked. The boy who once clung to my jacket at the riverbank was gone. My own voice came out low and cracked. If your mother were here, she wouldn't recognize either of you. That stopped him. For a heartbeat, his eyes flickered guilt confusion, something human. Then it vanished. He grabbed his keys. Don't bring her into this. Keep your house if it means that much. See what it gives you besides loneliness. He turned. His footsteps were fast, uneven. The door slammed so hard the frame shuddered. A second later, I heard the crash, the wedding photo of Marjorie and me hitting the floor. Glass shattered, scattering light across the room like fragments of a scream. I knelt, picked it up. A shard sliced my finger. Blood welled, staining the sleeve of my shirt. In the picture, Marjorie was smiling, hair caught in the wind, eyes bright enough to make the world seem gentler. I touched her face, whispered, I promised I'd protect this house. And I will, even if I have to do it alone. Outside, the rain had stopped. Evening light spilled through the window, a thin gold band stretching across the floor. I sat back in the chair, holding the frame close, listening to the slow tick of the clock. Each beat sounded like something breaking inside me, quiet, inevitable. The house still stood, but what once held it together had begun to crack. And I knew then the first fracture wasn't in the walls. It was in the bloodline of the Langdons themselves. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from the bank. The embossed logo of First Carolina Bank gleamed in the corner, but what froze the blood in my veins was the header on the first page. Confirmation of pension account transfer request. I read it once, then again, then again. Under the signature line was my name Langdon, written in a hand that wasn't mine. I sank into the chair. The paper trembled between my fingers. Morning light poured through the window, stretching across the table in a pale yellow band. The house was so still, I could hear the clock ticking, each sound sharp and deliberate, like something carving time itself. But inside my head there was only wind, the kind that comes before a storm. Someone had gone further this time, bolder. They were reaching for the last thing in my life, still untarnished. That afternoon, as I stood on the porch, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in years, low, raspy, but steady. Linda Graves, Marjorie's old friend. She used to live in Wilmington before moving up to Durham. Arthur. I had to call you right away, she said, breathless. Someone just filed a request to verify your federal pension account. The email domain was Langdon, but it wasn't yours. I work in the personnel division for the pension office, and the system flagged it. I double-checked twice. I gripped the phone until my knuckles went white. Thank you, Linda, I said quietly. Don't process anything yet. I'll handle it in person. When the line went dead, I sat down hard. Rain began to fall, tapping against the metal roof like small, deliberate knocks. Each drop felt like a word I didn't want to hear. This wasn't family tension anymore. This was theft, forgery, betrayal disguised as blood. That night I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. Streetlight shimmered across the thin layer of rain. On the table lay every document I'd gathered, the deed transfer notice, the forged signature from the notary, the bank confirmation. They looked harmless, just paper and ink, but they carried the weight of everything that could vanish from a man in a single moment. I knew I couldn't face this alone. I needed someone who understood the law and the cruelty that sometimes hid behind family gestures. The next morning, I drove downtown to Sullivan and Pierce Attorneys at Law, a 3-story brick building on Market Street. The office smelled faintly of ink and rain. They sent me to Catherine Sullivan, a young attorney in her 30s, sharp brown hair pulled back, clear eyes that seemed to see more than you said. Her handshake was firm, but not cold. She listened as I laid everything out, the forged deed, the banking interference, the familiar names behind it all. She didn't interrupt, didn't pity. She took notes, her pen steady. When I said Travis and Vanessa, she looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in surprise but recognition. "I've seen this before," she said, voice calm, deliberate. "My own father was scammed out of his pension after my mother passed. It's called elder financial exploitation. They prey on trust exhaustion and the fog of memory. They make you sign your own disappearance." But this time, she said, her voice hardening, "You came earlier than they expected." I sat still, listening to her words settle in the room like sand after a wave. She reached into her desk and pulled out a thick file folder. "Here's what we'll do," she said. "We'll file a formal investigation request with both the county clerk and the notary's office. I'll need you to sign a legal power of attorney so I can act on your behalf. Then we'll freeze all linked accounts and contact the bank directly to halt any pending transfers." I looked down at the paper she slid toward me. The words blurred for a moment, swimming behind the sting in my eyes. My hand trembled, but the line of ink came out straight. When I set the pen down, Catherine spoke softly like a judge delivering a verdict. "From this moment forward, no one touches your name without going through me." She printed a copy, clipped it neatly into a blue folder. On her screen, I saw a new entry appear, my name, a case number, and beneath it a single line: "Fraud prevention case initiated." I read it slowly, each word landing heavy and certain. For the first time in days, I felt something close to balance, the same quiet steadiness I'd known years ago, gripping a pole during a storm, my hands shaking, my heart steady. Catherine warned me the process would take time. "If we can prove intent," she said, "this could fall under elder asset fraud. That means criminal charges, not just civil penalties." She paused. "Are you ready to go that far?" I turned toward the window. Rain streaked the glass in diagonal lines, the kind that make the world outside look blurred and soft like memory itself. "I've lived long enough," I said, "to know there are storms you can't walk around. You have to walk through them to find the calm again." She smiled, faintly, nodded, and began pulling together documents. "We'll start with the notary verification," she said. "That's where the thread will unravel." As I stood, I looked around her office, the quiet order of it, the smell of coffee and paper, the hum of the printer. Everything had purpose here. It was the opposite of the chaos that had filled my home all week. Before I left, she said, "I'll call you in a few days once I have the first results. Keep every document safe, especially anything stamped in red ink. And if anyone comes to your door, you call the police first." I nodded. The hallway outside was long and narrow, lined with glass. Rain pattered softly against the panes, turning the world gray. At the end of the hall, a metal plaque caught the light, Sullivan and Pierce, gleaming faintly like a promise. I stopped for a moment, resting my hand on the cold railing. Outside, the sky was darkening, the wind picking up the sound of thunder, rolling far out beyond the trees. I knew then the storm had begun, not the one in the sky, but the one carrying my family's name. Winter came early that year. The cold in Wilmington wasn't sharp like in the north. It was slower, heavier, the kind that crept through cracks in the window and stayed in your bones. Every morning, I woke to see my breath in the air, the river outside a dull stretch of gray beneath a pale sky. The house had grown quieter than ever, its silence so deep I could hear the wind threading through the chimney. But beneath that quiet, I could feel it, something was moving. Catherine called one morning in early December. Her tone was brisk, but there was warmth underneath. "I've been in touch with Officer Daniel Ruiz from the county's Financial Crimes Unit," she said. "He's agreed to open a deed fraud investigation with us." Through the receiver, I could hear her typing the faint clatter of keys between bursts of wind against her office window. That was the moment I knew the fight had truly begun. That afternoon I drove to the precinct. Ruiz was 42, tall, lean, with the calm eyes of someone who'd seen too much and still believed in process. Catherine introduced us. "Then let me tell my story from the beginning." Ruiz listened carefully, taking notes, his voice low and steady when he spoke. "What you've described," he said, "fits the model of elder financial exploitation. If your signature was forged and a notary's involved, we're dealing with a criminal offense." Something inside my chest shifted. Then, not relief, not yet, but like a weight had been loosened. Ruiz promised to coordinate with the notary's office and the bank to pull surveillance footage and request a hold on Vanessa's submission. 2 days later, Earl showed up at my door with a file bound in twine. He said Grace had found something. We sat at the old kitchen table, the weak afternoon light falling across the papers. Earl opened his laptop and hit play on a grainy video Grace had retrieved from a neighboring security camera near the notary's building in Raleigh. The image flickered. Vanessa appeared, stepping out of the office in a gray coat, a large envelope in hand. She stopped beside a man in a dark suit, silver hair, thin shoulders. Harold Ness, the notary. Vanessa handed him the envelope. He glanced around, then slipped it quickly into his pocket. I froze. No sound, but I could still hear it, the sound of something breaking clean and final. That evening Ruiz called. His voice was firm. He took a bribe. "We have the proof." I couldn't speak. I just nodded, even though he couldn't see. Catherine came by that night. Rain followed her in, shining on her black coat. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright. She placed a folder on the table. Ruiz confirmed the findings, she said. Fingerprints on the notarized page match both Vanessa and Ness. Their meeting aligns exactly with the filing timestamp. I asked, "What happens now?" She looked up, her face lit softly by the kitchen light. "Now," she said, "we bring justice back where it belongs." Her words weren't loud, but they cut through the fog in my head like clean air after rain. She explained the process step by step. Ruiz would submit his report to the county court requesting formal charges for deed fraud. I would be the civil plaintiff, while the notary's bribery would fall under criminal investigation. She spoke of statutes, federal protections for senior citizens' clauses and procedures, but all I could hear was one thing. I wasn't alone anymore. As she gathered her papers, I looked out the window. Rain was still falling, slow and deliberate drops clinging to the glass and catching the glow of the lamp. "Do you think justice comes in time?" I asked. Catherine smiled faintly, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Justice doesn't hurry, Arthur," she said, "but it never forgets." I turned away before she could see my eyes. Outside, wind scraped through the trees. Water dripped from the eaves into puddles that shimmered in the porch light. I remembered the first night after Marjorie died, how I sat alone listening to rain just like this. The difference was that, back then, I felt hollow. Now I felt something else, anger, fear, and a small, fierce flame I hadn't known was still there. 3 days later, Ruiz and Catherine called me back to the precinct to sign the official complaint. Earl came too with Grace and her laptop, her face alight with purpose. The room was small, the fluorescent light cold and humming. Nobody wasted a word. Ruiz read through each section, signed, and slid the document across to me. I took the pen, drew a deep breath, and signed my name on the final line. The handwriting wasn't perfect, but it held steady like a pole brace in the wind. When I finished, Ruiz nodded. "This isn't just about you, Arthur," he said quietly. "This is how others won't have to go through the same thing." I met his eyes and nodded. For the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter, even if the road ahead was long. Grace backed up every file to an external drive, her hands moving fast, eyes bright with conviction. I realized then how grateful I was for all of them. That evening, when we stepped outside, the Wilmington sky hung low and heavy. The wind swept down Market Street, scattering the last yellow leaves. I stood there for a moment between two worlds, the quiet one of old age and the new one I'd been pushed into, the kind that required courage more than memory. By March 2025, the case was filed officially with the new Hanover County Court. I signed one last document, the red seal pressed deep into the paper. The scent of fresh ink rose sharp and cold. Outside, the rain still hadn't stopped. I knew as I looked through that wet glass that this was no longer just my story. This was the beginning of a war between truth and blood. And this time, I wasn't stepping back. That May morning, Wilmington glistened after a night of long rain. The streets were still damp, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and magnolia. I walked into the new Hanover County Courthouse, wearing the old gray suit Marjorie used to press before every important occasion. The hallway smelled of varnished wood and old paper. My footsteps echoed in even rhythm. The courtroom was already full. Rows of faces, neighbors, strangers, a local reporter checking his recorder. Across the aisle sat Travis and Vanessa. He stared at the ceiling, as if it could save him from the weight below. She kept her head down, fingers circling a thin gold ring until it lost its shine. Beside me, Catherine Sullivan flipped open her notebook, hair tied neatly, posture composed. Behind us, Officer Daniel Ruiz sat upright, calm as stone. On the bench above the brass nameplate read, Judge Evelyn Carter. When the back door opened, the room rose to its feet. The judge walked in, late 50s, steady gait, a woman who carried both kindness and steel in her spine. She placed a thick file on the bench. The sound of it meeting wood was sharp and final. The clerk read the names. When mine echoed through the room, Arthur Langdon, it stretched something deep inside me like a rope pulled tight between past and present. Catherine leaned close, whispered one word. Breathe. I did. The air tasted like dust and memory. The proceedings began. Travis's attorney spoke first, a polished man in his 40s, voice trained but carrying the faint tremor of overconfidence. He argued that his client acted out of concern that age had compromised my ability to manage property, that the emergency power of attorney had been proposed only to protect family assets. Each word he spoke landed like a nail driven into old timber. When he finished, Catherine rose. Her voice was even measured, no performance, just precision. She spoke of the forged signature, the falsified notarization stating I'd appeared in person on a day I was home with a witness. She mentioned the video showing Vanessa outside the notary's office, handing an envelope to Harold Ness, the notary public. She laid the evidence out carefully. Signature analysis. The email trail requesting a pension account transfer from an address bearing my name, but not my domain, and Ruiz's investigative report. Each exhibit clicked into place like stones in a bridge, solid, irrefutable. Ruiz took the stand. His voice was deep, deliberate. He detailed the chain of evidence, the surveillance footage, the timestamps, the audit of Ness's office supply logs. Then came the part that silenced the room. The serial number of the envelope matched the batch registered to the notary's office. The corresponding cash deposit never appeared in the records. I heard the faint rustle of people shifting in their seats. Then they called Ness. He walked slowly, eyes hollow, skin pale. His hands trembled as he laid them on the oath book. Catherine's tone didn't change. "Did you personally witness Mr. Arthur Langdon signing the deed on December 12th? He hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the defense table, then down. When he finally spoke, his voice was small. "I signed the verification. I did not meet him in person." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear a pen drop somewhere behind me. Catherine simply nodded, thanked him, and moved on. No triumph, no show, just truth doing its quiet work. The handwriting expert followed, pointing to the minute variations in pressure angle, and released the things you only notice when a hand has signed its name the same way for 40 years. My own signature glowed on the screen, old, familiar, fragile, standing across from its counterfeit twin. The defense lawyer tried again. He returned to the argument of good intent, insisting that Travis's motive was to protect me from myself, that forgetfulness and confusion had become patterns. He even cited reports of misplaced mail and fragmented recollections. I straightened in my seat. Every word of it was untrue. I could still remember the serial codes of transformers from decades ago, the sound a line makes when it hums under load. I wasn't confused. I was just old. Catherine requested one final witness. Earl Patterson took the stand with the steady gait of a man who'd built his life outdoors. He told the story of that December night, how we'd shared beers in his garage, the radio playing a baseball rerun, how he'd watched me cross the street and turn on my porch light around 9. His words were simple, unshakable. Then came Vanessa. She walked up smaller than before, hands folded so tight her knuckles whitened. Her lawyer invoked her right to silence regarding the ongoing criminal investigation. The judge allowed it. I looked at her and remembered the way she once moved through my living room, appraising it like inventory. Now she looked like a reflection that had lost its source of light. Finally, Travis. He stood throat-working. Catherine's questions were sparse, almost gentle. Who scheduled the notary? Who drafted the power of attorney? Why wasn't my counsel contacted? His answers stumbled, circling around excuses, fear, responsibility, misunderstanding. For a moment I saw something human there, a trace of the boy who once ran barefoot through the lavender rose behind our house. But guilt is a hole, not a bruise. You don't recover by naming it. Then came the outburst. The defense lawyer had begun to close when Travis snapped. His voice cracked across the room, raw and desperate. We just wanted the money before he wasted it all. Every sound vanished. The air turned cold. I could hear my heartbeat, slow and deliberate against the walls of my chest. Catherine didn't look at me, but her hand tightened on the table's edge. The judge wrote for a long moment, pen scratching against paper. When she finally looked up, her voice was calm and final. She spoke of the sanctity of notarized documents, of the state's duty to protect elders from financial exploitation, of the video evidence, and the confession of misconduct. Each sentence landed like a stake driven into the ground. She ordered all parties to rise. My knees wavered, but held. The gavel came down once, sharp, echoing. The deed transfer is null and void, she said. The defendants will be referred for criminal investigation on charges of elder financial fraud and bribery of a state notary. Immediate protective custody of the property is granted to Mr. Langdon. The room stayed silent. Somewhere behind me, someone exhaled. Maybe it was a stranger. Maybe it was me. Catherine turned, didn't smile, just gave a single nod. Ruiz stood, exchanged words with the clerk. Vanessa's head hung low, her hair falling forward like a curtain. Travis took one small step back, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. When I left the courtroom, my legs felt heavy but firm. The hallway seemed longer than before. Light spilled down on the polished tiles in clean, bright lines. I thought of the house, of the lavender, of the wedding photo that had once shattered and been framed anew. I thought of the paperwork still ahead of questions still to come. And beneath it all, somewhere quiet, I felt a strange stillness, like the river settling after a boat has passed its surface smooth again for the first time in years. The late afternoon sun tilted across the courthouse steps as I walked outside. Its light spilled over the Cape Fear River in a long silver band, the surface moving slow like something breathing. I walked toward the parking lot, each step pressing another layer of quiet over the storm still turning in my chest. When the car door closed, the noise of the city stayed outside. I rested both hands on the wheel, watching my reflection fade across the windshield. Then I said softly to no one but myself, "A father never wants to win against his son." The words fell into the still air of the car and stayed there, heavy, shapeless, undeniable. In the rearview mirror, the horizon burned red. A flock of birds lifted above the courthouse roof, cutting across the light. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The name on the screen, Pastor Samuel. I answered. His voice came slow and warm, the kind that carried the patience of storms survived. "Justice doesn't need anger, Arthur," he said. "It only needs the truth." I said, "Thank you, Pastor, just that." But before the line went silent, I heard him exhale as if in prayer. I stayed there until the sky shifted to gray-blue. By the time I started the engine, my hands had stopped shaking. Driving home, the wind from the river moved through the trees, carrying the smell of damp earth and salt. At the old bend by the docks, I slowed down. That spot where Marjorie and I used to sit on the 4th of July, eating sandwiches, waiting for fireworks. The memory passed through me like a thin cloud, soft, untethered. It no longer hurt. It simply reminded me why I had fought. When I turned into the gravel drive, Earl was standing on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, his old cap pulled low. He didn't speak right away, just nodded, then handed me a cold can of sparkling water. I opened it, the hiss of carbonation breaking the quiet like a stretched wire, finally letting go. He said his wife had heard the news on the local radio, told me to call if I didn't want to be alone that night. I told him I was fine, just needed stillness. He patted my shoulder, told me to bolt the door, then crossed the street, his shadow long and thin against the yard. Inside, I switched on the kitchen light. The yellow glow fell across the wooden table. The envelopes and legal folders Catherine told me to keep were still stacked neatly in place. I touched the corner of the top folder, cold, solid Riel. The phone buzzed again. "A message from Catherine restraining order is active. Police will respond if they approach your property. Criminal investigation open. Ruiz will update when we have movement." I read it twice. Something in my chest, some invisible knot, finally began to loosen. I texted back a simple, "Thank you," then set the phone down. For a moment I just sat listening to the faint echo of rain that wasn't really there anymore, just memory replaying itself on the roof. I thought about Travis. I tried to picture him as the boy with scraped knees grinning through a mouthful of sand, running through the yard with a stick like it was a flag. But then his voice from court broke through, "We just wanted the money before he wasted it all." The words were like stones. Still, I refused to let them harden into the kind that block a doorway. I walked to my study, opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a small wooden box I hadn't touched in years. I slid it open. Old cards, yellowed envelopes, handwriting that leaned to the right ink blurred by time, and maybe tears. There was one card from Travis and Vanessa's wedding printed with olive branches on the front. I lifted it. The paper felt thin, fragile. The handwriting was his young and strong. For a moment a thought came sharp and quick as lightning. Tear it. Rip it in half in 4, until nothing could ever be put back together again, just as they had done with my trust. I pressed my fingers into the fold. But then I stopped. From the living room I heard the wall clock tick steady, unhurried like footsteps moving through the years without regret. I took a deep breath and looked at the last line of the card, Travis's signature, the cross on his T drawn, with such careless confidence. The anger had thinned. What remained was something quieter, a fatigue deep in the ribs, and a thought so clear it felt like it had been written in pencil across the inside of my skull. Forgiveness begins when you stop touching the past. The phone buzzed again. Not Catherine Ruiz. He said the notary had signed his preliminary statement admitting to taking cash under the table, and his team was filing a warrant to trace related accounts. His voice carried no triumph, just the calm of a man bringing water to someone who's walked too long without it. I thanked him, said I'd sign whatever came next. He told me to stay calm, to avoid contact, and not to open any mail I didn't recognize. When the call ended, I stood at the window. The sun had dipped low, the last streak of gold fading from the horizon. Inside, the lights had softened, casting long amber lines across the wall. I thought about tomorrow, another trip to the courthouse, another round of paperwork, another meeting with Catherine to go through pension records. A list of small, tedious tasks that somehow meant survival. And then I thought about the white gardenias by the fence, how they'd bloom soon, and the lavender I'd planted last fall, their roots probably deeper now. A voice rose quietly in my mind, not Pastor Samuel's, not Catherine's, but my own. The voice of the man who once climbed power poles in storms, hands numb, feet braced against wind. Don't retreat, don't hate. Hold steady. Keep the light on. I sat down by the window, back against the old cushion hands resting on my knees. Outside, the river drew a faint white path under the darkening sky. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of water pass through me like a song I'd known all my life. When I opened them again, the space inside my chest felt wide enough to hold the truth, not cramped, not bleeding, just open. June morning. Wilmington was awash in sunlight. The light slipped through the oak branches, scattering into silver fragments across the river, like someone had tossed a handful of salt over the water. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window looking out at Maple Run Road, still almost too still. A garbage truck rumbled past its echo, fading down the block. Life, it seemed, had returned to normal. But no one in this town had really forgotten the Langdon case. A month had passed since the court's verdict. The news spread faster than I ever imagined. People talked in the cafe at the hardware store after Sunday service. I didn't hear it myself. Earl did. He said during the church council meeting, folks agreed that justice had been done, but not one of them felt joy. They called it a tragedy, not a victory. The story had stopped being about guilt or innocence. It had become about loss. One afternoon, Earl came by with an apple pie his wife had baked. He set it on the table, sat down, and stayed quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "People say you did the right thing, Arthur. But everyone feels sorry for him, because he lost the one thing that matters, trust." I didn't answer right away. Outside, the sunlight shimmered on the river, bright but cold. After a while, I asked, "And Vanessa?" Earl shrugged. "Left town last week. Moved in with her sister in Asheville. Doubt she'll come back." He paused. "Travis got fired. Real estate firm dropped him as soon as the investigation was confirmed. They don't want that stain." He looked at me, eyes soft but steady. "You don't have to say it, Arthur. Everybody knows you never wanted this." I nodded, stirring my coffee slowly. He was right. I'd never wanted to see my son fall. All I'd wanted was for the truth to stand. But even justice, when it finally arrives, leaves scars no court can heal. Earl left when the sun began to tilt low. His shadow stretched long across the gravel path, dividing the world into two halves, the past on one side, and something people like to call peace on the other. That evening, I climbed the attic stairs. The air smelled faintly of dried pine and lavender, the scent Marjorie loved. In the corner sat an old, dark brown chest I hadn't opened since her funeral. The hinges creaked softly as I lifted the lid. Dust floated like golden smoke through the late light. Inside were small boxes of letters, birthday cards, a few worn journals. I lifted them gently, one by one, until I found a small envelope, tucked between two photo albums. The handwriting on it was hers, delicate, slanted, unmistakable. Marjorie Langdon. Inside was a faded wedding photo taken right on this porch 40 years ago. I was young, in a gray suit. She was radiant. Her white dress caught mid-twirl by a gust of wind. On the back, written in blue ink, were 6 words. "Home is where honesty stays." I read that line over and over. The ink had bled in places, but the message remained whole, as if time itself knew better than to erase what she believed. I sat down, holding the photograph, listening to the faint tick of the living room clock echo through the house. Each beat pressed the truth deeper. It isn't the walls or the roof that make a home stand. It's honesty. I thought of all those years working the power lines, the storms that bent trees in half the nights, when lightning turned the sky white, and we climbed poles anyway. Back then, all we had was the rope, the current humming above us, and the faith that the man below would keep the ladder steady. That's what I thought of now, and I understood why I couldn't hate. Trust breaks easily, but if you choose not to crush the pieces, it can still grow back. I placed the photo back in its envelope and set it inside Marjorie's wooden letterbox. When I closed the lid, the quiet that followed felt full. Outside, the sun had faded to a thin ribbon of gold along the river. In my mind, I heard Catherine's voice from the courthouse. "Not everyone gets justice, Arthur, but everyone deserves to hear the truth." I had no desire to retell my story anymore. It had moved beyond me, become a warning, a reminder of what people lose when greed takes the place of love. Across the river, the lights of distant houses began to shimmer on the water. The current kept flowing, carrying those reflections downstream. I thought of Travis, wondered where he was, whether he could see the same evening sky. Maybe regret would find him. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer mine to carry. I sat still as the crickets started their song in the grass. A cool breeze rose off the river, brushing my face. For a fleeting moment, I felt Marjorie beside me, her hand resting on mine, warm, steady, forgiving. I didn't turn. I didn't want the vision to vanish. I simply smiled, eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the water in a thin line of light. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the river lapping against the bank. In my breath, there was the taste of salt, of water, of memory, of forgiveness. When I opened my eyes again, the sky had turned violet, and the moon was lifting itself above the trees. I stood, went inside, and shut the door softly. The wedding photograph on the wall caught the moonlight, Marjorie's smile still there, calm as ever, untouched by any storm. I whispered, "We kept the house, love. Not with wood or brick, but with honesty." Then I switched off the lights, letting the room fill with pale moonlight, quiet, clean, and whole again, as if the night itself understood that peace had finally come home. Spring came late that year, slow and gentle, like a hand resting on the shoulder of someone finally waking after a long exhaustion. The Wilmington sky was impossibly blue, thin clouds drifting past the tops of the oaks, as if time had decided to move softly again. I dragged the paint cans out to the yard and began sanding the fence, its boards bleached pale by too many seasons of rain. The smell of dry wood rose under the sandpaper, sharp familiar, and for a moment I could almost see Marjorie beside me again, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, both of us repainting before summer came, trying to keep the color from fading. When the first coat dried, I turned to the garden. The soil by the porch had been loosened last week, dark, rich, and fragrant with mulch. I planted the lavender one root at a time, pressing the earth around each base, sprinkling a handful of compost, patting the soil firm. The small green shoots trembled in the breeze as if testing their voices before they learned to sing. I watered them, watching the drops cling to the leaves like tiny beads of light, and thought about how a year can feel both heavy and fleeting. That afternoon, as I was cleaning up, Grace called. Her voice, bright and clear, came through the receiver like wind through a church hallway. She said the law school was holding a workshop on elder financial protection, and she wanted me to share my story. I paused for a long beat, then said yes. Not because I wanted to revisit the past, but because I'd learned that sometimes one story told at the right moment can keep someone else from falling. On the day of the event, I wore a pressed white shirt and left early so I wouldn't rush. The auditorium was bright, and open rows of gray chairs curved into a half circle. In the front row, young faces glowed with curiosity, laptops open on their knees. Grace introduced me briefly, then stepped aside. I stood behind the wooden podium, took a slow breath, and began from the first winds that had rattled my porch to the day I walked out of the courthouse on steady legs. I didn't make villains or heroes. I just told what had happened and what had kept me standing when everything else fell apart. When I finished, the room was so still I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. A few hands went up. One student asked how to talk to family without crossing the line between care and control. I told her, speak early, use clear words, and if you must, write it down. Another asked what it felt like to see my son across the courtroom. I said it felt like cold water on a hot day, sharp, shocking, but clean. Someone else asked who I hated most. I said I was tired of greed, but hate never healed anyone. Truth did. When it was over, Grace walked up with eyes shining in that deep, quiet way joy sometimes shows itself. She said if I was willing, she wanted to help start a small fund with the church to support retirees who'd lost their savings to fraud. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just nodded. "Let's do it," I said, and it felt like setting down a weight I'd carried too long. A week later, we met in the small side room of the church wooden table pot of tea, a plate of cookies, window open to the breeze. Pastor Samuel sat at the head grace beside him, and the church's bookkeeper taking notes. We mapped out the beginnings of the Langdon Foundation. Nothing large, nothing grand, just enough to matter. Our first goal fund, legal consultations for seniors in need, open a phone line, organize neighborhood talks. Pastor Samuel smiled and said, "The biggest things start with what we can do today." I looked at his hands, thin and veined, and thought how steady they seemed. Catherine helped next, efficient, as always. She reviewed the bylaws, drafted forms, assigned someone to handle records. I didn't understand all of it, but this time I didn't feel lost. Everyone worked in rhythm, no one louder than the other. By Friday evening, they all came to my house for dinner. Catherine arrived early with a basket of salad and a bottle of juice. Earl brought flounder he'd caught that morning, the scent of salt still on his hands. Pastor Samuel came last, carrying a loaf of bread still warm from the corner bakery. I lit the grill on the porch. The fire cracked softly in the wind, smoke curling into the lavender air. The smell of searing fish mingled with the garden's fragrance until the whole yard felt alive. Sunlight stretched across the wooden table, tinting everything gold. We ate slowly and talked about small things. Catherine told a story about an old woman who almost lost her savings to a phone scam. Earl talked about how the oak tree in his yard came back greener this year. Pastor Samuel shared a story about a young drifter the church had helped find a bed for the night, saying that kindness is sometimes just moving your chair an inch to the side so someone else can sit. Each story felt like a floorboard being laid something solid underfoot again. As the plates emptied, Catherine turned to me. She asked how it felt now that everything had settled. I looked out at the flowers, listened to the river far off, and said quietly, I didn't win anything. I just kept what I loved, truth, and this house. The words came lighter than I expected, stripped of the weight they once carried. Pastor nodded. Earl smiled faintly. Catherine's shoulders eased like someone setting down a box she'd been holding too long. When dinner ended, we pulled our chairs near the fence to catch the breeze. The evening wasn't dark yet, but the shade had begun to fall at the base of the trees. I told them about my years on the night shift, climbing poles in rainstorms, hands numb, locking a cable at the exact tension it needed, because if you left it loose, the whole street went dark. Pastor listened closely and said, "Some things only pass if someone's willing to stand there and hold the light steady." Earl laughed and added, "Guess that's what we're all doing, one bolt at a time." Before leaving, Catherine said she'd send me the 6-month draft plan for the foundation. Grace would handle outreach with the law school, Pastor would coordinate church groups, and Earl volunteered to drive seniors to our community sessions. I thanked each of them. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone in that house, even when the night came and the door shut behind them. When the small gate closed, the river wind swept through again, brushing the lavender like a familiar hand. Their laughter still lingered on the porch, echoing softly against the wood, before dissolving into the cool air. I stood there watching the river turn violet, listening to the crickets begin their song. Peace, I thought, isn't silence. It's when every sound finally knows where to rest. Inside, I washed the dishes, wiped the table dry. Before turning off the light, I stopped by the wedding photograph. The porch lamp cast a thin reflection across the glass. Marjorie seemed to tilt her head slightly as if listening. I whispered to her, "Spring has come back, love." Then I flipped the switch. Darkness drifted in soft and kind, and in that darkness, I could hear the wind move through the lavender outside a quiet answer I'd been waiting a whole year to hear. Dusk settled over Wilmington like a thin blanket draped across the sky. The river caught the last of the gold light and stretched it into a soft ribbon drifting slow toward the sound. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind off the water mix with the faint metallic hum of the screen door trembling in its hinge. From down by the gate came the creak of the old wooden mailbox. The postman, an elderly man with silver hair and the patience of someone who's seen too many seasons, walked up the path, a white envelope in his hand. He smiled and said almost gently, "Mail for you from Raleigh." I took it, and my heart stumbled once. The handwriting stopped me cold. Travis Langdon. I sat on the porch step, the last beam of sunlight slipping over my hand and catching on the edge of the envelope. Inside was a simple birthday card, olive branches embossed in silver, the handwriting unsteady ink smudged at one corner. "Hope you still keep the lavender garden." Nothing else. No apology, no justification. Just 8 small words, soft as a pebble, dropped into still water, spreading ripples I couldn't name. I read it again and again, then folded it carefully. I didn't feel anger or joy, only that quiet emptiness that follows after a long storm when the air is too still and every sound feels like it's waiting for permission to exist. I stood and went back inside. The house smelled of time-old wood paper, a trace of dried lavender from the vase on the shelf. I opened the cabinet where Marjorie's keepsakes rested. Her little wooden letterbox was still there, hand-painted, its cherry color faded to soft brown. I placed the card inside between her letters, and the wedding photo, and an old Christmas card. When I closed the lid, the sound was small, final, like a sigh that meant peace, not sorrow. Outside, the sky had turned violet. The river wind brushed through my hair, cool and light. I closed my eyes and listened to the hollow sound of my own breath, not sad, not restless. Maybe because there was nothing left to expect. Maybe because somewhere deep down I had forgiven, long before I knew I had. I remembered what Marjorie said the day we moved into this house. A home isn't just where you live, it's where the best part of you stays. When she died, I thought that part of me went with her, but it hadn't. It had stayed inside the bricks, the lavender, the morning habit of opening the windows instead of locking the world out. When the moon began to rise, I heard Pastor Samuel's voice calling from the fence. He carried his worn Bible and a few printed sheets. I poured him a cup of tea as he settled into the chair beside me. He handed me the papers, a list of the first seniors in town who'd received help from the Langdon Foundation. I looked at the shaky signatures, and between those names I saw what Marjorie and I had dreamed of, a home that could reach beyond its walls, a house built from trust. After he left, I stood before the wedding photo again. Moonlight caught the glass, turning her smile into something alive. I whispered, "You see, Marjorie?" We still kept the lavender, and the honesty, too. Outside, the wind brushed through the flowers, the scent rising faint and clean like an answer. I sat back in the chair, letting the breeze slip under my collar. I thought of Travis, not with bitterness, only a tender ache. Maybe he was somewhere in a small apartment drinking cold coffee, remembering the mornings I'd taught him how to tie his shoes. I didn't need to know if he was sorry or struggling. I only hoped he'd find what he'd lost, not the money, but the truth inside himself. I said quietly, I don't wait for them anymore, but if the day comes when they stand at my door, I won't close it. I'll just tell them what Marjorie once said, that trust can't be bought back, but peace can be found again right here in this house. The wind rose, moving gently through the lavender rose, the leaves brushing together in a sound like a greeting. I looked up first, stars glinting above the purple sky. Something filled my chest, then warm and steady, like everything I'd lost had returned not in form, but in spirit. Thank you for staying until the end. If you've ever been betrayed by your own blood, tell your story. Let others know that not every wound calls for revenge, and not every justice needs a gavel. Sometimes peace itself is the gentlest form of justice. Share this story, leave a comment, press like and subscribe so that stories about truth, kindness, and finding home again can keep traveling, just as I finally found my way back to mine.